In the midst of a brutal snowstorm on Highway 70, a black diner owner quietly counted her last $47 with only 7 days left before losing everything. At her lowest moment, 15 weary Hell's Angels knocked, seeking shelter. Without hesitation, she opened the door and shared her final meal. By morning, the roar of hundreds of motorcycles filled the air outside her diner. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. Sarah Williams stood behind the counter of Midnight Haven Diner, staring at the stack of crumpled bills in her weathered hands. $47. That was it. That was all that stood between her and the final notice tucked beneath the cash register. The one that gave her exactly 7 days before the bank took everything. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the small diner perched on Highway 70 in the Colorado mountains. Snow fell in thick, angry sheets, turning the world beyond the glass into a white void. At 50 years old, Sarah had seen plenty of storms, but this one felt different. This one felt like an ending. She moved slowly around the empty diner, her footsteps echoing off the worn linoleum floor. The red vinyl booths sat empty, their surfaces cracked from years of use. The coffee pot gurgled weakly, half full of the bitter brew that had been sitting there since noon. It was nearly 8 o'clock now, and she hadn't seen a customer in over 3 hours. Sarah paused at booth number 4, Robert's favorite spot. Even 2 years after the cancer took him, she could still see him sitting there, his gentle smile warming the room more than any heater ever could. They bought this place together 15 years ago with nothing but dreams and a small inheritance from her grandmother. "We'll make it work, baby," Robert used to say, his dark eyes twinkling with optimism. "This place will be a light for travelers, a home away from home." Now the lights flickered overhead, threatening to go out just like everything else. The heating system groaned and wheezed, fighting a losing battle against the mountain cold. Sarah pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and walked back to the counter where the foreclosure notice seemed to mock her with its official letterhead and cold bureaucratic language. The diner's CB radio crackled weakly in the corner, its antenna bent from years of neglect. Once, that radio had been their lifeline to the trucking community, a constant stream of voices sharing road conditions, warnings, and the occasional joke. Now it mostly sat silent, just another relic of better times. Sarah opened the register again, counting the money one more time, as if the numbers might magically change. They didn't. $47 wouldn't even cover the electric bill, let alone the 3 months of back payments the bank demanded. She'd already sold her wedding ring, Robert's tools, everything of value they'd accumulated over their 23 years of marriage. This diner was all she had left. The wind picked up outside, shaking the building so hard that the old neon sign buzzed and flickered. Through the window, she could see the snow piling up against the gas pumps, burying them under white drifts that looked like gravestones in a cemetery. Highway 70 was completely invisible now, lost beneath the storm. Sarah glanced at the clock above the coffee machine. 8:15. Time to close up, flip the sign, and admit defeat. Tomorrow she'd call the lawyer, maybe see if she could work out some kind of payment plan, though she knew it was hopeless. The bank had been patient enough. She was reaching for the light switch when she heard it, a low rumble that cut through the howling wind like thunder. At first she thought it might be a snowplow, but the sound was different, deeper, more rhythmic, like a heartbeat made of steel and chrome. Sarah pressed her face to the window, squinting through the snow. At first she saw nothing but white. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge from the storm. Headlights. Lots of them. And beneath the lights, the distinctive silhouettes of motorcycles. Big ones. Harley-Davidsons by the look of them. The rumble grew louder as the bikes approached, their engines revving against the wind. Sarah counted 15 machines in total, all riding in tight formation despite the treacherous conditions. As they pulled into the diner's parking lot, their headlights swept across the windows like searchlights, filling the empty dining room with harsh white light. Sarah stepped back from the window, her heart pounding. She'd heard stories about motorcycle clubs, seen them in movies, but she'd never actually encountered one. These men, and they were all men, she could tell even through their heavy winter gear, looked like something out of a nightmare. Leather jackets, boots, helmets that hid their faces. They moved with the confidence of people who weren't used to being told no. The lead rider dismounted first, a tall man with broad shoulders who seemed to command the others without saying a word. He looked toward the diner, and Sarah could feel his gaze even through the window. Slowly, deliberately, he began walking toward the front door. Sarah's hand hovered over the light switch. She could turn off the lights, lock the door, pretend the diner was closed. These men wouldn't know the difference. They'd probably just move on, find somewhere else to wait out the storm. Somewhere that wasn't her problem. But as the man approached the door, she saw something that stopped her cold. He was limping. Not badly but enough to notice. Behind him, the other riders were dismounting, and she could see that several of them were struggling. They'd been riding in this storm for hours, maybe longer. They were cold, exhausted, and probably desperate for shelter. The man reached the door and paused, his gloved hand hovering over the handle. Through the glass, Sarah could see his face clearly now. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 45, with gray streaking his dark beard. His eyes were tired, weathered by years on the road. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen enough hardship to recognize it in others. He knocked, 3 gentle raps that somehow managed to be both respectful and urgent. Sarah looked back at the $47 on the counter, then at the foreclosure notice, then at the man waiting in the storm. Robert's voice echoed in her memory, a light for travelers, baby, a home away from home. She walked to the door and turned the lock. The moment Sarah opened the door, the full force of the storm hit her like a physical blow. Snow swirled into the diner and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. The man standing on her threshold was covered head to toe in ice and snow, his leather jacket frozen stiff, his beard white with frost. But it wasn't just one man. Behind him, Sarah could see the others dismounting from their motorcycles, and her breath caught in her throat. These weren't ordinary bikers. The leather jackets bore the unmistakable patches she'd seen in news reports. The Death's Head logo, the winged skull, the words Hell's Angels emblazoned across broad shoulders and backs. 15 of them, all massive men with arms thick as tree trunks, faces weathered by years of hard living, and the kind of presence that made smart people cross to the other side of the street. The leader was easily 6 feet 4 inches, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a ponytail and a gray beard that reached his chest. Tattoos covered every visible inch of his arms, intricate designs that told stories Sarah didn't want to know. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, and his eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter ice, held the weight of someone who'd seen too much and done things he couldn't take back. Behind him, the others looked like they'd stepped out of a movie about motorcycle gangs. One had a shaved head covered in tattoos, including a spiderweb on his neck. Another sported a mohawk despite being well into his 50s, his arms so heavily muscled they strained the seams of his jacket. The youngest couldn't have been more than 25, but he carried himself with the swagger of someone trying to prove he belonged with these dangerous men. "Ma'am," the leader said, his voice rough from the cold and probably decades of cigarettes. "I know this is an imposition, but we've been riding for 12 hours straight. The highway's completely shut down about 10 miles back, and we're not going to make it much further in this weather." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to close the door, to lock it, to call the police. These men looked like they could tear her diner apart with their bare hands, and probably had done worse to people who'd crossed them. The patches on their jackets weren't decorations. They were warnings. But then she saw something that gave her pause. Despite their intimidating appearance, they stood respectfully in the snow, waiting for her answer. None of them pushed forward or tried to force their way in. The leader kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening despite his size. And there was something in his eyes, exhaustion, yes, but also a kind of desperate hope that she recognized all too well. "How many of you are there?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. 15, the man replied. "I'm Jake Morrison. We're part of the Thunder Ridge chapter, heading back from a memorial service down in Denver. We've got cash for food and coffee and we won't cause any trouble. We just need somewhere warm to wait out the storm." Sarah looked past Jake at the group of men removing their helmets. They were a terrifying sight, beards, tattoos, scars that told stories of violence and hard living. Hands that looked like they could crush bone. Faces that had seen the wrong side of too many fights. But she also saw something else. Exhaustion that went bone deep, the kind that came from fighting the elements for hours on end. These men, dangerous as they might be, were at the end of their rope. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "All of you." The relief on Jake's face was immediate and profound. "Thank you," he said simply. "You have no idea what this means." The Hell's Angels filed in one by one, stomping snow off their boots and shaking ice from their jackets. They were massive men, most of them the kind who'd learned to take up space in the world through necessity and reputation. Their leather jackets creaked as they moved, the patches and pins catching the diner's fluorescent light, chapter names, ranks, badges that marked territory and allegiances in a world Sarah had never been part of. But despite their fearsome appearance, they moved carefully in the small diner, conscious of their size, respectful of the space they'd been given. The one with the mohawk actually held the door for the youngest member, and Sarah caught several of them wiping their boots extra clean before stepping onto her floor. Sarah counted them as they entered. 15, just as Jake had said. The oldest looked to be in his 60s, gray-haired and dignified despite the death's head on his jacket. The youngest, the one she'd noticed earlier, had nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly as he pulled off his gloves, looking more like a scared college kid than a member of America's most notorious motorcycle club. "Find seats wherever you can," Sarah told them, moving behind the counter, "that I'll get some coffee going." The men settled into the booths and counter stools with obvious gratitude, their frozen leather creaking as they moved. Up close, Sarah could see the details that the storm had hidden. The intricate artwork of their tattoos, the careful maintenance of their patches, the way they instinctively arranged themselves so that the older, more senior members took the best spots while the younger ones deferred without being asked. The young one, Sarah heard someone call him Danny, sat near the window, still shivering despite the warmth of the diner. An older man with intricate tattoos covering both arms and sergeant at arms embroidered beneath his chapter patch took the stool closest to the counter, nodding respectfully when Sarah made eye contact. "Haven't seen weather like this in years," Jake said, settling onto a stool near the register. His jacket hung open now, revealing more patches, President in bold letters, service ribbons that suggested military background, and a small American flag pin that seemed oddly patriotic for someone society labeled an outlaw. Sarah poured coffee into thick white mugs, the familiar ritual calming her nerves. "Sugar and cream are on the counter," she said. "Help yourselves." As the men warmed their hands on the hot mugs, Sarah took stock of her situation. 15 Hells Angels. A nearly empty freezer. $47 to her name. These weren't the kind of men you wanted to disappoint or turn away hungry. But looking at their faces, weathered, tired, grateful for simple warmth, she realized that beneath the leather and patches and fearsome reputation, they were just human beings caught in a storm. By 10 o'clock, the storm had only gotten worse. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow was falling so hard that the windows looked like they'd been painted white. Jake's prediction about the highway being closed proved optimistic. According to the radio, Interstate 70 was shut down in both directions with no estimate for when it might reopen. "Could be tomorrow morning, could be 2 days, Jake told Sarah as she refilled his coffee for the third time. "State Patrol's not even trying to clear it until the wind dies down." Sarah nodded, doing mental calculations that didn't add up no matter how she worked them. 15 men. 2 days. Virtually no food left in the kitchen. The eggs and bacon were long gone, the hash browns a memory. She'd managed to find a few cans of soup in the back storage room, but that wouldn't stretch far. Her $47 might buy enough groceries for 1 day if the roads were clear and the stores were open, which they weren't. The bikers had settled in for the night, some dozing in the booths, others playing cards with a worn deck that Pete had produced from his jacket pocket. They'd offered to pay for their meal, but Sarah had waved them off. How could she charge them for the scraps she'd managed to cobble together? Danny had fallen asleep with his head on the table, exhaustion finally overtaking him. He looked even younger in sleep, maybe 22 or 23, with the kind of face that belonged in a college classroom rather than on the back of a Harley. Marcus had draped his leather jacket over the kid's shoulders, a gesture so gentle it made Sarah's throat tight. "He reminds me of my son," Marcus explained quietly when he caught Sarah watching. "Same age, same stubborn streak. Always trying to prove he's tougher than he really is." "Where's your son now?" Sarah asked. "Afghanistan," Marcus replied. "Third tour. Comes home next month if all goes well." His voice carried the weight of a father's worry, the kind that never really went away no matter how old your children got. Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, surveying her unexpected guests. In the harsh fluorescent light, they looked less intimidating than they had when they'd first arrived. Their leather jackets hung over chair backs, revealing ordinary clothes underneath, flannel shirts, worn jeans, work boots that had seen better days. These were working men, blue-collar guys who probably had more in common with her late husband than with the movie stereotype she'd expected. Jake approached the counter, his expression serious. "Sarah, we need to talk about payment. You've been more than generous, but we can't just—" "Don't worry about it," Sarah interrupted. "It's just food." "No, it's not," Jake said firmly. "It's hospitality. It's kindness. And it's costing you money you probably don't have." Sarah felt her cheeks flush. Was her financial situation that obvious? She tried to keep her voice steady. "I manage just fine." Jake's eyes moved to the foreclosure notice sticking out from under the register, and Sarah realized her attempt at discretion had failed. His expression softened with understanding. "How long do you have?" he asked quietly. 7 days, Sarah admitted, the words falling out of her mouth before she could stop them. But that's my problem, not yours. The hell it is, Jake said. You opened your door to us when you didn't have to. You fed us when you couldn't afford to. That makes it our problem too. Sarah shook her head. I appreciate the sentiment, but there's nothing you can do. I'm behind on 3 months of payments, and the bank's not interested in sob stories. Jake was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. Then he looked up at her with eyes that seemed to see straight through her defenses. Tell me about this place, he said. How long have you owned it? 15 years, Sarah replied. My husband, Robert, and I bought it with my grandmother's inheritance. It was his dream, a place where travelers could find a hot meal and a friendly face no matter what time of night they rolled in. Sounds like he was a good man. The best, Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. Cancer took him 2 years ago. I've been trying to keep the place running, but, she gestured helplessly at the empty diner, the flickering lights, the general air of barely controlled decay. But it's hard to run a business on memories and good intentions, Jake finished. Something like that. Jake was quiet again, and Sarah could see him thinking, weighing options she couldn't guess at. Finally he spoke. What if I told you that you've helped more people than you know? What if I told you that this place, your kindness, has probably saved lives? Sarah frowned. I'm not sure what you mean. 15 years is a long time, Jake said. A lot of travelers pass through this stretch of highway. A lot of people in trouble looking for help. You remember all of them? Sarah shook her head. There have been thousands. But you helped them all, didn't you? Hot coffee, a warm meal, maybe a kind word when they needed it most. I tried to, Sarah said. Robert always said we were supposed to be a light for people. A beacon, you know. Someone who'd leave the porch light on for travelers. Jake smiled, and there was something almost secretive about it. A beacon, he repeated. Yeah, that's exactly what you are. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, a commotion arose from one of the booths. Pete was shaking Danny awake, his voice urgent but gentle. Kid, wake up. You're having a nightmare. Danny jerked upright, his eyes wild and unfocused. For a moment he looked around the diner like he couldn't remember where he was. Then recognition dawned, and his shoulders sagged with relief. Sorry, he mumbled. Bad dreams. They come and go. Want to talk about it? Pete asked, settling back into his seat across from the younger man. Danny shook his head, but after a moment he spoke anyway. It's always the same dream. I'm lost on some dark highway. My bike's broken down and there's nowhere to go. No lights, no help, just endless darkness. He looked around the warm diner at the faces of his fellow riders, at Sarah behind the counter. But then I wake up and I'm here and it's okay. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she couldn't quite name. How many people had sat in these same booths, found comfort in this same warm light? How many travelers had been lost and cold and desperate, only to find refuge in the unlikely beacon she and Robert had built on this forgotten stretch of mountain highway? She looked at Jake, who was watching her with that same knowing smile. What aren't you telling me? She asked. Nothing you won't figure out soon enough, he replied. But right now we need to focus on practical matters. You said the bank wants 3 months of back payments. Sarah nodded reluctantly. How much? $12,000, she admitted. Plus late fees and legal costs. It's probably closer to 15. Jake whistled low. That's serious money? More than I'll ever have, Sarah said. Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but $15,000 isn't the kind of thing you find in couch cushions. This place is finished and maybe that's okay. Maybe it's time. No, Jake said, his voice sharp enough to cut through her resignation. It's not time. Not for a place like this. Not for a woman like you. He stood up, fishing his cell phone out of his pocket. I'm going to make some calls. And Sarah. She looked up at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. Don't you dare give up yet. This story isn't over. As Jake walked toward the front door, presumably to get better cell reception, Sarah found herself staring after him. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't know what kind of calls he intended to make or what difference they could possibly make. But for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something she'd almost forgotten how to recognize. Oh. Jake returned from making his phone calls with snow in his hair and an expression Sarah couldn't read. He'd been outside for nearly an hour, pacing back and forth in the storm, his voice occasionally rising above the wind as he spoke to whoever was on the other end of the line. The other bikers had watched him through the windows, exchanging glances that suggested they knew something Sarah didn't. Well? Pete asked when Jake finally came back inside, stamping snow off his boots. Tomorrow morning, Jake said simply. Maybe sooner if the road's clear. What's tomorrow morning? Sarah asked. But Jake just smiled and poured himself another cup of coffee. It was Marcus who broke the tension. The older biker had been quiet most of the evening, content to play cards and nurse his coffee, but now he was studying Sarah with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. You know, he said slowly. You look familiar. Sarah raised an eyebrow. I doubt that. I don't get out much these days. No, I'm serious. Marcus set down his cards and really looked at her, his head tilted slightly as if trying to remember something important. How long did you say you've been running this place? 15 years. And before that? Before that, Robert and I lived in Denver. He was a truck driver, did long hauls all over the western states. I worked as a dispatcher for his company. Marcus snapped his fingers suddenly so loudly that several of the other bikers looked up. That's it. Tommy Patterson. You saved Tommy Patterson's life. Sarah frowned. I'm sorry I don't. Marcus was still laughing as Tommy's hug nearly lifted Sarah off her feet, but the sound was swallowed by the sheer wave of noise that filled the diner. Voices overlapped, hands clapped shoulders, boots stomped on the old linoleum as more and more people poured inside. The diner, which only hours before had felt like a mausoleum for dreams, now vibrated with life and memory. Faces kept appearing in the doorway, half frozen but smiling wide, carrying the weight of old debts and the warmth of recognition. Tommy finally set Sarah down, tears glittering in his red beard. You don't know how many times I've told your story. To my kids. To my neighbors. To anyone who'd listen. You didn't just save me that night, you gave me back to my family. You gave me time. Sarah blinked hard, unable to stop the tears threatening to spill. I didn't do anything anyone else wouldn't have done, she whispered, though the words felt smaller now, weaker against the tidal wave of gratitude filling the room. Wrong, Tommy said, his voice booming again as he looked around the diner at the growing crowd. You did something most people wouldn't. You cared. More people pressed forward. A woman in her 60s wrapped Sarah in a fierce hug and told her how she'd once found herself stranded here in a blizzard with 2 terrified kids, and Sarah had turned the back booth into a makeshift playroom to calm them down until the roads reopened. A young man with a scar on his cheek thanked her for calling his mother when he'd been too ashamed to do it himself. A retired trucker admitted that the only reason he'd made it home to see his granddaughter born was because Sarah had patched him up with hot coffee and stronger words when he'd nearly fallen asleep at the wheel. One by one they came. Every story was another thread weaving itself into the fabric of something bigger than Sarah could comprehend. And in the corner, Jake stood silently watching, a satisfied smile tugging at the edge of his mouth as if this was exactly what he'd been waiting for. By midnight, the diner was bursting at the seams. Strangers shared booths like old friends, kids dozed against their parents' shoulders, and steam from dozens of cups of coffee fogged the windows. The snow outside still fell thick and heavy, but inside the midnight haven, warmth and laughter rolled like thunder. Sarah moved from table to table, her apron long forgotten, hugging, laughing, crying. Every time she tried to insist that she hadn't done anything special, someone else would step forward with another memory, another reason she mattered. Somewhere between the stories, the laughter, and the clatter of dishes, something inside her finally cracked, not with despair but with release. She realized she had been carrying her grief like chains, convinced that Robert's dream had died with him. But standing in that sea of faces, she saw it. He hadn't built the diner for himself. He built it for them. And she had kept it alive. When the noise finally ebbed enough for Jake's voice to cut through, he raised his cup of coffee like a preacher lifting a chalice. You see, Sarah? You thought this place was dying. But it's more alive than ever. You've been a light on this mountain, and when a light like that flickers, people show up to keep it burning. The crowd murmured their agreement, glasses lifted, fists pounding tables in rhythm. Sarah pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, her heart aching with gratitude and disbelief. I don't know how to thank you, she managed. You already did, Jake said softly. 15 years of thank yous. Tonight it's our turn. And with that, the hats came off, wallets opened, hands passed jars and baskets down the rows of booths. Cash, checks, even a few folded IOUs piled up on the counter in front of her faster than she could comprehend. Some gave hundreds, some gave a crumpled $5 bill, but every contribution carried the same weight. Love repaid, debts honored, a beacon defended. By the time the first streaks of dawn lit the snow-draped peaks, Sarah stood staring at the overflowing counter, her hands shaking as she counted. 15,000, then 16, then still more as another trucker walked in late, apologizing for the weather. Enough to save the diner. Enough to buy time. Enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. When she finally looked up, the whole diner was watching her, waiting for her reaction. Her throat closed, her eyes brimmed, and for once, words failed. She only nodded, tears sliding freely down her cheeks. The cheer that went up shook the diner to its foundations. And outside, the storm began to break. The first fragile beams of sunlight cut through the clouds, scattering across the parking lot full of trucks, bikes, and cars like 1,000 headlights pointing in the same direction. The Midnight Haven had never lived up to its name more than it did in that moment. Would you like me to keep this going into what happens after the storm clears? Like how Sarah rebuilds the diner's future with these people's help? Or stop at this turning point where hope is restored? Big guy. Red beard. Drove for Western Mountain Transport. The parking lot was a sea of chrome and thunder, bikes packed tight in shining rows that stretched out onto the highway shoulder. Engines idled like restless beasts, their low growls carrying across the valley as more riders poured in from every direction. Inside the diner, Sarah moved like she was caught in a dream, embraced again and again by men and women whose faces pulled old memories from the corners of her mind. These weren't just customers. They were pieces of her past, fragments of moments she'd long ago forgotten, now stitched together into something monumental. Patches from Oakland, Denver, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, Las Vegas. Chapters that rarely mixed were shoulder to shoulder in her little diner, laughing, trading stories, clapping one another on the back. Brotherhood ran thick in the air, and all of it centered around her. A giant of a man with arms as thick as her stovepipe stepped forward. The Oakland patch spread across his back was unmistakable, but when he spoke, his voice was quiet, reverent. 23 years ago, you found me half dead out there in your lot. Bike busted, body frozen. You called the ambulance, stayed with me, made sure my old lady knew I was alive. I never forgot. His rough palm engulfed hers as he added, Big Mike Hendress, Oakland president. I owe you my life, Angel. The name hit her like a spark. She remembered flashes, snow stinging her face, a broken-down bike, a pale young man she hadn't been sure would make it through the night. Now here he stood, larger than life, treating her like the one who'd saved him, when she'd just done what anyone with a heart would have done. And then the flood came, more voices, more memories. A Phoenix rider who'd slept on her diner floor waiting for parts, fed and warmed by her and Robert. A Denver biker whose daughter survived thanks to her quick directions and strong coffee for the road. Every face, every patch carried a story, and every story carried her name. Jake's voice finally cut through the din. He dropped a thick envelope on the counter with a solid thump. $68,000, he announced. Every chapter here pitched in. Sarah froze, staring at the envelope as her hands shook. That's too much. I can't accept. You can, Big Mike interrupted, his voice rumbling like an engine. And you will. On one condition. Sarah's voice wavered. What condition? A woman with Salt Lake colors leaned forward, her eyes sharp but kind. You keep this place running. You keep being the angel you've always been. The cheer that rose from the crowd shook the diner's windows. Jake unrolled a sheet of paper, spreading it across the counter. Architect's plans. Expansion. Bike lounge. Secure parking. Maintenance bays. Midnight Haven, Biker Haven. Official stop for every chapter from California to Colorado. Another voice chimed in, gravelly, authoritative. And we're setting up protection. Round the clock. No one touches this place. No one touches you. You're under our wings now, Angel. Before Sarah could speak, the CB radio crackled to life, loud in the sudden hush. Breaker 19. Road dog calling the Angel. We got 40 bikes rolling in from Utah. 30 minutes. Sit tight, family's coming. Sarah's hand trembled as she lifted the mic. Road dog, this is Midnight Haven. Doors are open, coffee's hot. Ride safe. The diner erupted in cheers. Outside, riders gunned their throttles, engines roaring in a chorus that echoed off the mountains like thunder rolling across the sky. Jake came forward one last time, handing her a small envelope. From Tommy Patterson. Prospect with Denver now. He wanted you to have this. Inside was an old, worn business card. Beneath it, a note scrawled in blocky handwriting. 13 years I carried this. Time to bring it home. Thanks for giving me a second chance. Sarah pressed the card to her chest, tears streaking her face as she stepped outside. The morning sun gleamed off endless rows of bikes, patches telling stories of loyalty, of debts paid, of lives forever changed. Jake swung onto his Harley, looking at her over the rumble of his engine. You know the best part of this? Last night you didn't see angels or outlaws. You just saw 15 men who needed help. And you opened your door. That's what started this. That's what made all of this. He gave her a nod, a smile. Keep the light on, Angel. We'll handle the rest. As the Thunder Ridge chapter roared out, their engines blending into one unstoppable symphony, Sarah felt Robert beside her, his voice carried on the wind. Told you this place was special, baby? Never imagined it would become the heart of something this big. 6 months later, the expanded lot held over 100 bikes on any given weekend. Midnight Haven Biker Haven graced the pages of Easy Riders as the most important Hells Angels stop west of the Mississippi. Security was unshakable. Respect was automatic. And Sarah's little diner had become more than a rest stop. It was a sanctuary. The CB never stopped buzzing. "How's our angel tonight?" voices would call. And Sarah always answered the same way, "The light's on, the coffee's hot, and the road's always open for family." Because that's what Midnight Haven had become. The heart of the highway, proof that kindness could change everything, and that even the roughest souls would always find their way home.